Who has heard of cloud native?
Yeah, cloud native. It's about 5 people.
Who has heard of Twitter? Uh-huh.
More Twitter.
At Twitter, he actually created the open source program. He led the open source efforts. This bio, let me read it again. This guy did shortcuts. He's going to stand here, and please, you just be putting your hands together as I speak. Chris Aniszczyk is an open source executive and engineer with a passion for building a better world through open collaboration. Oh yeah, hold on. When I say it, then you clap so that people will hear it. He's currently a CTO at the Linux Foundation, focused on developer relations and running the Open Container Initiative, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNCF. Furthermore, there's a furthermore there. He's a partner at Capital Factory where he focuses on mentoring, advising, and investing in open source and infrastructure-focused startups. For many years, he actually served on the Eclipse Foundation's board of directors, representing the committer community and the Java community process, JCP, executive committee. In a previous life, he bootstrapped a consulting company, made many mistakes, lead and hacked on many Eclipse.org and Linux-related projects. He said, Odogu, you are not wrong. You are not wrong. Please put your hands together again for him.
Thank you for the warm intro and basically reading off my LinkedIn bio. So, all good. I'm super happy to be here. I got in, yesterday, so I'm a little bit jet lagged, but with all the energy in this room, and after a couple cups of coffee this morning, I'm definitely awake. I think one of the most amazing things about being involved in open source for 25 plus years now is just meeting people all over the world. It's truly been a blessing for me, and hearing Anjana and other people talk about how they got start. Like I got my start by contributing to Linux 20 plus years ago. I got my first job there, so it's just an amazing feeling to see everyone here sharing the same sentiments. I'm moving a little bit forward here, but super glad to be here, and now I'm feeling a little bit older since I've been here for 25 plus years working in open source, and there's a whole new generation of folks coming on. But when Samson reached out, it's like, hey, come speak to Open Source Africa. I was supposed to be here 2 years ago. Obviously, COVID, pandemic kind of put a damper on a lot of our lives, in general. And my initial idea was to talk a little bit about the growth of Kubernetes at the time and CNCF. And so this time, based on, I think a lot of folks are a little bit new sometimes. People obviously here in this room don't know what cloud native is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of, where cloud native came from, a little bit of a history, and more importantly, kind of how to get involved, a variety of programs that we have for folks to get involved, not only through just code contributions, but, documentation and internships and a bunch of other things. So thank you again for having me here. So, as you're aware, there's some kind of boring data here. Like, obviously, the world has changed with COVID. Everyone has to learn how to work remote. I don't know about all y'all, but I'm in 30 Slacks now, 20 Discords. I saw my, doing doctor appointments virtually. We had to go shift our office environment. So all of us had to kind of shift our work. And what's happened behind the scenes is a lot of companies out there, whether it's a Zoom of the world, or it's your bank, or it's your local company, all have had to adapt their infrastructure to support the growth of online services. And cloud native technology, which CNCF hosts, has kind of been been shepherding a lot of that and enabling that kind of technologically growth to let these companies expand as much as they needed to. So all this basically shows is the pandemic that we've lived through the last 2 years has basically forced us to all change the way we work. And a lot of that growth has been enabled by open source and cloud native technology. So how many people actually have heard of Kubernetes or have used Kubernetes here? I'll go for 20% of the audience. So, so we do constant polls throughout the community out here, but we think there are about 6.87 million cloud native developers out there, and those are basically people that are writing cloud native applications, whether they're using Kubernetes or some other cloud orchestration framework. A lot of people get their first kind of experience with this whole ecosystem with containers. Containers, anyone create a Docker container, run a Docker container? Yes, maybe? Okay, it's about the same. So, there's millions and millions of folks out there using this technology now to kind of power, their ecosystems. There's even now a documentary that we produced where if you actually truly need an intro to how things kind of came together, I recommend searching Kubernetes documentary on YouTube. It was a little bit interesting when this project came together because they filmed it during the pandemic, which was a little nerve-wracking, but highly recommend. It's about 30 minutes of your time. It'll give you a good story of how things kind of started and put everything together. So, cloud-native software, what exactly is it? Well, it's running basically every major, company behind the scenes, whether, you're Apple or, Zendesk, banks, all have kind of modernized their infrastructure. I'm a huge runner. Adidas, is running cloud-native Kubernetes infrastructure to power, their store, recommendation systems, and so on. So this software, just like open source, has become pervasive throughout, the industry, and you may not even realize this. I talk to a lot of people, my parents aren't super technical, but, your iPhone, your Android, your TV, people are even trying to put Kubernetes on airplanes. There's just Linux and Kubernetes. It's just completely everywhere and pervasive throughout, our lives, and it's something for us to kind of, think about, as we kind of get involved in open source. So, in terms of the actual definition of, what is cloud-native software? We actually have a formal definition within the CNCF that we've kind of put together, but essentially it's all about empowering organization to run scalable applications in a modern way. There's a variety of specific technology that kind of adheres to this cloud-native definition. It could be a container, maybe it's a service mesh, immutable infrastructure. The kind of key characteristics of cloud-native systems are they're loosely coupled components. If you hear a lot of people talking about cloud-native, like breaking things into little pieces, I think this is a good practice anyway when you're developing software, versus doing, old school monolithic things. You kind of break things into little services, stitch them together, and make them resilient and so on. It's just more manageable to do so. The CNCF, which is the organization that I helped start about a little over 6 years ago, essentially is a host of these projects, this community, and so on, that kind of bring all this, technology and basically democratize, software that, internet scale companies have been using to scale. Before I started this organization, I spent about 5 years working at a company called Twitter, where we were basically building out our own kind of infrastructure. And at that time, oddly, there was still a lot of open source stuff out there, but the Googles of the world, the Facebooks, the Netflix of the world, they weren't as forthcoming of sharing this software. And so the CNCF was truly born to basically democratize the software that internet scale companies were using to scale, so everyone could do it. It's not only just a FANG company or an internet scale. Anyone over the world could go scale as much as these organizations have. So there's a definition, and that's kind of how the CNCF works. So today, one of the larger open source foundations out there, if you're familiar, there's a lot of them. There's Apache Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, CNCF. We host about 120 of these projects. They're all different little bits of Lego pieces, right? It makes it a little bit confusing and complicated because, you could get Kubernetes, which is great, but generally you also need something to monitor your services. You need something to potentially do logging. So our whole motto is provide the Lego open source projects where people all over the world could build them and stitch them together to run scalable infrastructure. That's basically our job and role, to the community. And so one thing we've also pointed out, I was actually talking to Nadir on the car. This unfortunately looks terrible, but yeah, that does not look as good. But essentially, if you look at the highest velocity open source projects out there, you have things like, if you have Linux, Kubernetes, you have some of the .NET ecosystem, Homebrew. And so, if you kind of look at this, a lot of our projects fall on the higher end things where you have, 4,000, 5,000, authors, pushing code all the time. So there's a lot of activity, a lot of movement, a lot of contribution from different companies all over the world. To kind of make this space a little bit more approachable, one of the complaints we've gotten is, I'm kind of new, I don't understand how this stuff works. Well, we built something called the Cloud Native Landscape, which is this awesome static site powered by Netlify and all this good stuff. So if you have your phone or laptop in front of you and you go to l.cncf.io, you could have an overview of our whole ecosystem and also kind of just in general of what else is out there, in terms of software. So if you're, starting in the infrastructure space and you're very new to, cloud native software and open source infrastructure software, check out the landscape. It's a beautiful static site that we've kind of built that lets you kind of browse and find things, because I think some of the hard parts of getting started in, I would say lower level infrastructure stuff, whether it's Linux or Kubernetes, is just like having a mental mind map of where you could put things and how to get started. So this is a useful tool that we provide basically for, the world to learn a little bit more about, cloud native technology. So, when I started this talk, I was going to talk a little bit about kind of, the history of cloud native, how we kind of got here, a little bit about the future directions, and then I think more importantly for all the folks in this audience is, how do I get involved, in the community? Where can I go to learn? And I'll try to do it based on, different skill levels. I was going to do some demos, but, obviously it's a little bit hard when I don't have my laptop, so bear with me right now. So let's do a history lesson, because now I feel old. I've been involved in open source 25 plus years. When I started my career, there were these things called mainframes and, these kind of monolithic, beastly machines. And if you kind of look at the history of kind of, let's call it computing, is back in the day, we had these large, big, mainframes, non-virtualized hardware where you would go run workloads on, right? They were very closed systems. I don't know if some people know the company Sun, but, they kind of pioneered some of this. They're one of the more kind of pioneers in this space. Eventually, people started to virtualize some of these things. So you had VMs came around. So VMware pioneered this. You had infrastructure as a service. AWS. Obviously, most people probably now play with AWS these days in their lives. But back in the day, leasing and renting compute was not really a thing. You kind of had to set it up yourself. PaaSes came around, and then essentially what eventually happened when we shifted from kind of this old model to this kind of new model is things kind of became more open. You had less closed systems, more open source, more democratization of things. We went from monolithic big, apps running on like bare metal to more, let's call it microservices-based, smaller types package things running on clouds. And we've shifted from basically physical hardware to virtualized to now containerized. A lot of stuff behind the scenes, even if you're using things like Lambda or all this stuff, a lot of stuff behind the scenes is usually running some type of containerized infrastructure to enable that experience to use. So I think the overall history, if you kind of look last 20, 25 years, has gone from closed ecosystems to open, open source ecosystems like CNCF, Apache, and so on, from monolithic large systems to microservices, and from more virtualized to containerized systems. That's kind of the whole history of, if you kind of look at cloud native computing. So the way I look at it is things have become more open and more malleable over time. The other thing people kind of talk about is like, well, okay, great, you have you stopped at 2018, but it's 2022 now. Or 2020 if you don't count the last 2 years, like I unfortunately don't want to some days. But so where are we essentially headed? So like I've mentioned, back in the day, things were very tightly coupled, right? And eventually people started to containerize things and break apart. There are some new exciting technologies that are happening where, I'll make this prediction here where, I think we're going to enter a third kind of wave of computing. And what I mean here is we went from essentially virtualized VMs to containers to eventually WebAssembly, which is kind of a unique technology that came from our browser, friends, which essentially think of it as a lightweight, runtime that kind of is like a container runtime, but a little bit different. So I think in the future, you're going to see a little bit more, smaller baked apps running on kind of WebAssembly sandbox environments. If you don't know anything about WebAssembly now, I highly recommend learning. It's a great kind of entry point. I think there'll be a lot of career opportunities there. A lot of companies I know are hiring outside the Kubernetes folks that they all want. A lot of people are looking at WebAssembly. It's definitely kind of the future direction, I think, of computing, so you should definitely take a look at it. Do it. So, other kind of future things, we have a technical body in the CNCF. Essentially, it's a board of folks that kind of are responsible for the overall technical direction for all of our projects. A lot of interesting trends happening. So, I was an old school Linux person, and, back in the day, you used to work on Linux in a lab, and eventually some crazy people wanted to start putting Linux in cars, in phones, right? So we have Android everywhere, which is essentially Linux. People are doing the same thing for Kubernetes. Kubernetes is now being extended to meet end user unique needs. So, a lot of telcos now are putting Kubernetes in like little radio towers, right? Edge devices. So what's actually happening is the same thing that happened with Linux. People will take a piece of open source software and maybe rip it apart or do something to make it work in their particular use cases. Same thing is happening for Kubernetes, because at the end of the day, a lot of software is just orchestrating workloads, and if it already works for the data center in many other cases, why can't I go extend it for other environments like the edge and so on? A couple of things that I won't dive into much because I'd rather talk about how to get involved in the community is, I think it would be useful to share this is, I think a lot of people are familiar, you familiar with DevOps, right? You've heard of DevOps? Yes, yes? A little bit, maybe? All right, so there's this other new thing that, I'm a little bit passionate about that's called FinOps, which is a little bit different. So when you start using the cloud or any online-based service, you could basically use as many resources as you want, right? So I don't know how many people have had the experience where I've left stuff on AWS and GCP running that has resulted in large cloud bills, unfortunately. You just forget about it, right? And so I think what's happened is it's just easy, right? We just don't care. Developers just don't even think about cost, really, right? Because you're either working for a company and you don't have to care about this, or you just have like a little project. So FinOps is kind of a new discipline which is trying to combine developers and also financial operation folks and business analysts. It's basically the people inside that are handling cloud bills, which sadly is mostly done in like spreadsheets. Like it's more manual. So the idea here is to combine both kind of developer and financial operations into one. And so you'll see this as a common thing. Like there's a lot of jobs now that, if you could just Google FinOps jobs, you'll see this thing kind of bubbling up. But I would definitely take time to look at that, because there's this whole field that is burgeoning around, just like kind of DevOps did in the last 10 years, around just making sense of different cloud bills and kind of unifying service, predicting cloud bills. It's a great area to get involved in the early days from my perspective. I'm not going to talk about all this other stuff. It's a little chaos engineering gray. You got to go test your crazy system to make sure they're resilient. So let's talk about how to get involved in cloud native for folks. So when I started my career, I just kind of like, back in the day, we used to have these like little floppy disk things, right? And so that's how I learned Linux. You eventually install it on your computer, you kind of play it around. If you're very new to things, just start with the basics. And sometimes like just terminology, we tend to use words in open source and companies that are just hard to understand, right? Like if you don't have any understanding of these basic things, whether it's like an API, firewall, whatever, service, pod, it just makes life hard. So glossary, we have a cloud native glossary in CNCF that we've introduced for people to basically learn all these terms. It's being translated into a variety of different languages, and it's a great place for everyone to kind of get involved in. Linux, sadly, like Linux is still everywhere. It's a great technology. I think having some familiarity with the command prompt and just understanding Linux basics is always good. We have a free edX course that we produced at the Linux Foundation with the help of Linus and so on. GitHub, I love my GitHub friends. There's something called lab.github.com. As you're learning Git and all this stuff, I would definitely recommend checking out these kind of online exercises. They're a great place to kind of get started. As you learn Git, you have to learn GitHub. It's a fantastic piece of technology. And then maybe for like some of the more like nerdier folks who have like a gardening habit, there's this awesome project called GrowLab that's put together that basically, if you have access to a Raspberry Pi and maybe some, into a little bit of gardening, you could basically set up your Raspberry Pi to like automatically monitor your, garden, water, and so on. So to me, it's like, it's an awesome project that's not too hard to kind of, set up. It's well detailed. They have a great community, great Slack, and so on. But it will basically teach you all the basics of like installing packages, how to manage like, Linux on a Raspberry Pi, and how to do some basic programming. So that's kind of like my first intro to folks is like, don't worry about containers, just learn the basics and start there. Containers. So this is generally the next step, when it comes to kind of embracing the cloud native community. There's a lot of great resources out there. Play with Docker. I think it's play.docker.com. Just very much teaches you the basics of what a container is, how to, build an application, containerize it. I recommend starting there. There's a lot of different great resources out there. It's an amazing woman named Nana who's got this YouTube channel, Tech World, which highly recommend everyone go check out. She just distills things in a great way. But once you learn a little bit more about Docker and containers, basically prepares you kind of for the next kind of step in cloud native journey. Prometheus. So monitoring is an interesting thing. So generally when you build an application or service or anything, you eventually have to get to a point where you have to observe it. What happens if it starts, failing? How do I kind of restart it? Prometheus is actually an interesting technology that is what we basically call a sister project to Kubernetes. So Kubernetes came from Google's, internal infrastructure, and they had a sister project actually to Kubernetes internally. For them, it was called Borg. Eventually, it became Kubernetes, but they had Borgmon, which was used to monitor all their stuff. Prometheus is inspired by the same thing, and I think if you're going to start your kind of journey understanding how to monitor applications in a modern way, especially with kind of Prometheus pull-based metrics, totally necessary, and there's some great resources that kind of get involved. So highly recommend to learn the basics of monitoring infrastructure. So once you get there, I finally recommend people diving into Kubernetes a little bit and learning kind of the basics there. So I mentioned before the edX course. I think the documentary is just a fun thing to kind of just get the concepts. A lot of people tend to use Kubernetes based off cloud-based managed services, right? So if you have access to AWS, they have EKS, GCP has GKE. There's some great lightweight local resources that you can install on your computer, whether it's Docker Desktop or Rancher Desktop, that just makes the whole installation super easy, and I recommend folks experience that way. There's also the amazing Kelsey Hightower who put together this Kubernetes the hard way. If you truly want to get your hands a little bit dirty, I'd recommend that guide, but it is very kind of hard in depth and teaches you kind of the low-level stuff. The other thing that we've recently done in CNCF is we put together, we have a variety of certifications, classes, and they all tend to be focused on advanced individuals. And in the last, I would think, 18 months, we've made a marked shift to produce more introductory things, whether things it's like the glossary, because a lot of people are new, to open source, new to our ecosystem, and having people just dive into something advanced is just hard. So highly recommend the KCNA that we put together. And then one thing that I'm doing is for everyone that basically has attended OSCA, we're giving basically free KCNA, so you go sign up and try it out yourself if you're interested in cloud native technologies. And I'll figure out how to get that. Code to everyone after the talk. And then finally, as you kind of learn this, we have probably one of the more friendlier communities out there. And I think someone said this on stage earlier that like learn by doing, learn by teaching type things. So you learn a ton by contributing. Outreachy, as mentioned before, we've participated in that. It's fantastic. We have LFX mentoring, Summer of Code. There's all these great mentorships program. I think there's some people that have participated in some of these programs in CNCF. So highly recommend just get up, learn how to contribute. These are paid, opportunities. You'll learn a lot. You get paid to do so, and then a lot of people end up finding career opportunities there. I've been a Google Summer of Code mentor for maybe since 2004 or 5 for many projects. So it's a great experience, overall. The other unique thing that Kubernetes does compared to other projects is they have shadow programs. So what that basically means is if you want to learn how to do release management, or if you want to learn how to do PR work, if you want to learn how to do the build and all this other particular things, you could actually go shadow someone. You actually don't have to do work. You just basically attend meetings, follow someone, and then learn from that experience, and then potentially help become a lead or get involved with that community. So to me, this is an amazing opportunity for this did not exist back in my days, in open source, but highly recommend shadowing in individuals. And then, other ways to get involved, host events, meetups, you just don't have to do code. There's so many different ways to contribute out there. So And we recently held a KCD Africa, so I'm very, very excited about that and would love to see more of those. So final kind of bits about getting involved in the community before I open it up for questions is every community is going to have different values, different approaches to how they operate. Kubernetes has some distinct values, right? It's all about distribution is better than centralization. We have this mantra that community over company. A lot of folks shift companies, but we're all one community at the end of the day. Automation over process, inclusive is better than inclusive. And then, obviously, evolution better than stagnation. These are just core values that have kind of shaped, the Kubernetes community. And any open source projects you go to, you should kind of go look for something like this. Not everyone has them, but to me, this is generally a good sign if a project kind of is upfront about it. And then finally, kind of, all are welcome, in the CNCF, whether you're contributing code, docs, translations, hosting events. We have so many opportunities to get involved. We have mentorship programs. We have meetups that you could organize. You can attend events. You could go chat with one of our ambassadors. You could go find me in this conference afterwards and ask me any kind of questions or learn through some demos. Please find a way to kind of get involved and learn. There's so many opportunities. The other thing that I want to do, I'll eventually figure out how to get this out to everyone, is we're hosting an event in Spain. We're actually finally gathering. It's nice to see people again after 2 years. We're hosting KubeCon, and we're going to give free registrations for everyone that's attending, OSCA as a way to, get more people involved, which would be awesome. And we're also going to do 5 scholarships for folks that could apply to go actually travel to Spain, bar nothing. So so hopefully we'll see some of you there. And then kind of finally, I was kind of looking at numbers and with open source, contribution is the currency. It's how to get involved. And one thing that I would like to challenge is I was trying to figure out where's Nigeria in kind of the overall ranking to CNCF projects and the communities. So it's number 40 overall amongst all countries. My challenge, to be honest, number 2 in Africa. You're a couple countries, I think, behind South Africa, which is awesome, to be honest. But my challenge is contribute more, get more people involved so you can continue to have more impact. And the one interesting thing is a lot of people are like, why contribute to open source outside of just learning and potentially networking? It's actually good for business. There's research out there from Harvard that basically shows companies that actually contribute get 100% more productive value from the source that they're using versus people that are just free riding and using. So if your boss ever asks you why do you contribute? Go point them to some Harvard research that shows that this is actually a good thing. So we have a great community, and it's been an honor to speak here. Definitely a little bit jet lagged, but...
A round of applause for Chris.
Thanks. You could find me on Twitter at CRA, and I'll eventually figure out how to distribute some of the codes and all that stuff, so anyone that's into OSCA can go contribute to the community.
Chris is going to take 5 minutes of questions, so if you have any question for... Okay. Can you come?
Okay, my name is White Gold. I just wanted to know the use cases of Kubernetes on AI projects.
Let me repeat that question so I understand it. So the question was, what is the use case for Kubernetes for AI projects? So I would say the primary use case would be, oh no, sadness. Of course, no one knows how to conference anymore. So I would consider plumbing I would consider the main use case is kind of like plumbing. So if you use AI projects, you have a TensorFlow or PyTorch. Kubernetes would basically be used kind of behind the scenes to help orchestrate a lot of those workloads. There's a lot of integration points between TensorFlow and PyTorch to actually use Kubernetes as the orchestrator to farm out things, whether it's on GPUs or CPUs. So for most people, if you use a cloud-based service, it's running on Linux, but you may actually not know that. That may not be your exposure point. So for AI developers, it's all about integrating to provide scalability on the AI workloads for the most part. So.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Sure.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. My question is, it's contributing to open source like Kubernetes.
Yeah.
It's somehow easier for people coming from a back-end kind of perspective. From guys coming from cybersecurity or security perspective, or ops perspective, you deploy on servers. stuff like that. How do you contribute to it? Because like you're more of a user than you can actually code stuff. So how can you contribute?
So let me repeat the question so I understand it. How do you contribute if you're just a user versus like a developer?
You are coming from an operations kind of background. You don't code so much JavaScript or Python or stuff. So
if you're not like a back-end infrastructure person, you're more of like a front-end, how would you contribute? So a lot of these projects have, they have like websites and other things that could use help from front-end development skills. Or you look at Prometheus. Prometheus ships with a UI, right? I think it was originally done in Angular, and I think they're porting it to React now. Like there are avenues where you could actually go use those skills for maybe like the front end aspects of their project or a site, but you're gonna have to go project to project to figure that out. Like Kubernetes itself, most of the stuff is just Go code in the back, but there is a dashboard that ships, and so there are opportunities for you to kind of get involved, at that point. I'm happy to like personally talk to you and find an avenue for sure. So thanks for your question.
All right, a round of applause for
Cool,
Chris.
thank you. Yeah.